Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Well, today I am in the office and bedroom of Professor Jeffrey Kopstein. Professor Kopstein is the head of the Center for Jewish Studies at UC Irvine and a professor in the political science department here. He researches a lot of fascinating things pertaining to anti-Semitism, Jewish history. He teaches a class on Jewish power at the university. And today, Professor Kopstein is starting the beginning of a 48-hour sleep-in his office. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
I think this is the first time I've traveled to somebody's bedroom, at least a bedroom for a night here to record anything. But can you give a little bit of background? You know, you've been in the university system for a long time. You've been at UC Irvine for a long time. What's been different since October 7th than normal?
What's been different? Well, first, thanks for having me. And really what's been different is I had become director of the Center for Jewish Studies here at UCI in the summertime. And I thought it would be an easy job because I'd done it before at the University of Toronto, where I was one of the founding directors. But it turned out, of course, not to be easy. And one of the most difficult parts, and the part that's really led to my sleep-in or sit-in in my office, has been the impossibility of holding public academic, not partisan, not advocacy, but public academic talks on the situation in Israel, on the Israel-Hamas war. And the reason it's impossible is because the last time we held one on November 14th, it was disrupted. Nothing has happened to the people who disrupted it. They haven't faced any, as far as I see yet, any disciplinary charges. And I've been given no guarantee that this won't happen again. And under those circumstances, not so much for the safety, although the safety can be an issue, but also for the basic dignity of the process of education. For me, the classroom is kind of a sacred space. And to see that disrupted, I don't want to be able to work under those circumstances, have to work under those circumstances. It's the only unit on campus that's faced this, that has to face regularly the disruption of events. And so I want to see that stop. Not to mention, if I could go on for one more second, even our events that have nothing to do with Israel, right? Yiddish poetry or the history of the Holocaust, those events all have police protection. Now, how necessary that is, I don't really know. I don't want it to be necessary, but I venture to say that no other unit on campus has to deal with this at all. Now, at Berkeley, there's a much more serious issue. And I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, please. Well, why don't you tell listeners what's been going on at Berkeley and what was the real inspiration, because you're sort of inspired by what's happening at Berkeley.
Exactly. At Berkeley, they've faced not simply repeated bouts of much more serious anti-Semitic incidents on campus, but actual violence. And there's an issue of student safety there now. And a professor in the political science department, who's also the chair of Israel Studies, is Ron Hassner. He has started, and I think it's been going on now, 10 days he's sleeping, eating, and teaching in his office, and he hasn't gone anywhere. Wow. That's quite something for the last 10 days. And he wrote me and told me about it. And I said, we don't face exactly the same problems on our campus here at UCI. Our leadership is generally friendly and supportive, both of Jewish students and of, freedom of speech on campus as a whole. But we do face the kinds of problems that I just explained to you. And I think it's appropriate both to express my solidarity with Professor Hassner at Berkeley and what they're facing, and to bring to the attention of our university leaders the limitations on our ability to perform our educational function, given what's going on our campus right now.
It's a strange time in American Jewish history. And, interestingly enough, we're both right now teaching courses. I'm teaching a class on American Jewish history. You're teaching a class on the history of anti-Semitism. So just where we're at, one of the interesting frames to look at our current situation is right now, obviously, the Jewish world is basically split 50-50 demographically, North America and Israel, right? We're basically, 50-50, depending on how you view the statistics. And there's this wider debate that's happening in the West right now, this neat attempt to separate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. We can probably go on all day there. One of the remarks, I think I said this in a past podcast, but I'm thinking about this a lot and, want to bounce this off of you. Post-October 7th, we saw in some way a failing of Zionism, right? The chief goal of Zionism was to keep Jews safe. October 7th was a complete collapse of the government. The government failed to keep Jews safe, ergo it was a, albeit temporary failure of Zionism. And it was at that moment in history where if the wider international Jewish community, and let's talk about, America, embraced the Jewish community and said, this is terrible, let's make sure that you are comforted, all of that. I actually think a lot of American Jews, their views might have shifted away from Zionism because you have category A of the Zionist project failing to keep Jews safe, and in America, generally, I think I speak for both of us, we feel safe, albeit a little bit of rising fear here and there. But we saw a total switch. I mean, we saw all the worst fears really of Jews in history vis-a-vis anti-Semitism. Not that it's been as bad in America, but the fear is always whenever something happens, whatever shakes the status quo, whether it's religious fundamentalism or extreme secularism or communism on one side, extreme nationalism on the other, eventually it turns anti-Semitic. And we really saw that in America, which is leading to this really weird sense of Jews in America of there's a giving up. And, I don't want to say this too strongly, but we're talking about the article in the Atlantic, the end of the golden age for Jews in America.
Yes.
Which, of course, also a fascinating time for us to be discussing this article. We're both teaching classes about this, where the two sort of quote unquote saving political identities of the Jewish world in the 20th century were Zionism and liberalism. And Jews really clung to those two. And now they're both under attack in a really strong way. So where do you situate us, less in your context as a, I guess, activist for this week, but in your scholarly anti-Semitic work, where do you situate this period in Jewish history?
I think we're at a sort of an inflection point right now. And the inflection point is exactly as you identified it, right? Up until now, right? Really within our adult lifetime, a couple of important things did happen that appear to be changing. The first one was this distinction between being Jewish in America, a Jewish American or American Jew, and having an affection for Israel, that the seeming contradiction between those two things sort of went away, right? It was okay because the multicultural model in the United States meant that becoming American or being American was not like a religion. It meant that you could have residual affections for your ethnic and cultural homeland, whether that was Israel or Italy or Germany or Japan or wherever. And what we've seen over the last sort of decade is a kind of a renationalization of identities all over the world, where people do worry about whether there is this question of dual loyalty. And that issue of dual loyalty, which is a long-standing trope, an anti-Semitic trope, it has come both from the left, from the right, where it had always been there, but also the left, that somehow the Jews aren't to be trusted on matters of whatever, because whether their opinions on domestic policy, taxes, and especially foreign policy, because they're Jewish. And that's come back since October 7th. So I do surveys of students on American campuses. And I have a new survey on the university using data from students at the University of California. And what that shows is that, and I use a very series of old questions that try to tap into dimensions of anti-Semitism, dual loyalty, Holocaust minimization, secret Jewish power, and distasteful Jewish traits.
Sure.
And I tap into those and trying to figure out how much students share those kind of odious views. And what you would have expected after October 7th is there to be a kind of a general outpouring of sympathy for Jews, that those levels of anti-Semitism, whatever they're at, say it's at 20%,
sure,
it would have gone down. To my kind of dismay, and probably not as a surprise to you, the reverse occurred. It went up, not gigantically among these students, right? Not gigantically, but discernibly and statistically significantly went up. And I'm not really sure what to make of it yet. And anti-Israel sentiment went way up. I'm not sure what to make of it yet. I'm still trying to figure it out, but I think you've put your finger on something, that we're at this inflection point where Jews are feeling somehow the license to be anti-Semitic, right? The license to express those views has come out, and Jew has been distributed and widely spread, and it's opened up the possibility for being that way. And this is what Jews, both on and off campuses, are feeling, and they're feeling them for a reason. It's, of course, you also said that we're not in the 1930s. There's not much public violence at all, widespread violence against Jews. The idea that it's unsafe to be Jewish, that's still pretty minimal. But we're all feeling like there's something there which hasn't been there before, right? And that's an uncomfortable feeling. And I'm there with you, right? Yeah. And I know our students are feeling it. I know that the broader public is feeling it. And so that's where we are. We're at this inflection point that Franklin Foer identified as a potential. I mean, he went a little bit farther in saying we are past the golden age, right? I'm not sure that's actually true. Maybe we can recapture what we had before. You know, which of us don't miss 10 years ago, right? And that's true. But I think you put your finger on a number of very important things.
Yeah, it's interesting. And also just my experience growing up, I always like to highlight this for students. There is this idea that, 15, 20 years ago, there was no anti-Semitism. I mean, I grew up in an area in San Diego. Jews were actually, it was illegal for Jews to buy property until UCSD opened in the 1960s, right? They wanted Jonas Salk, right? He happened to be Jewish. So if you want him to head the department, you have to allow Jews to buy property around UCSD. So definitely grew up in sort of the old school WASPy anti-Semitism, but Jews, not that they were applauding that, but Jews were okay with the idea of anti-Semitism on the right. Okay is relative, but since the New Deal, Jews have voted Democrat about 5-1, right? So 80% of Jews vote Democrat. It's been relatively consistent for the last, 15 elections. Yeah. And so Jews always situated themselves, on the left, and even more so in progressive movements. And I think what's been so damaging, both I see on the academic level, talking to a lot of professors, and talking to a lot of students who would all identify as somewhere between liberal and progressive, is it's almost like they're getting stabbed in the back by the same communities that they tried so hard to build. So the idea of, say, DEI departments and affirmative action, Jews are pro these things, on a level that you compare it to any other ethnic group. Jews blow any other ethnic group out of the water. LGBTQ rights, rights for African Americans. And I think it's been an interesting shock, I think, people have been seeing the writing on the wall for, already 5, 10, 15 years. But I think that's also part of the shock, is that it's not necessarily that I feel something bad is going to physically happen to me, but the spaces that, Jewish values, I would argue, help cultivate, diversity, inclusion, even freedom of speech, right? If we disagree with each other, let's sit down for coffee and, yell at each other for an hour, as opposed to, me writing mean things about you behind your back, right? All of those values of liberalism that Jews helped create, now those same, vehicles and institutions are being turned against Jews. So it seems almost a lot more overwhelming in some sense. If it's just that I need to worry about, getting beaten up on the way to the car, okay, great, I'll take a couple self-defense classes, right? I don't want to minimize that, but there's ways of dealing with that. Now it seems like it's much more structural, right? And much more systemic. And I see a lot of Jewish students feeling so overwhelmed. They don't even know how to, what do we do if we are, a gay student or a trans Jewish student? We can't go to, any of the LGBTQ clubs on campus, let alone, nationally. And it seems like there's this interesting tension. I would love to get your thoughts on that specifically.
Well, you're right. I mean, it's become very difficult. I mean, the vast majority of Jews will vote Democratic in the next election, right? That's pretty much assured. And President Biden on these questions has been right up the line, quite good. What you're pointing to is the kind of the spectrum that's to the left of that, which has become inhospitable to Jews who do not share a certain set of views about Israel or about their own privilege, if you will. And that's an interesting thing. Historically, the charge of Jewish privilege, right, was really one launched by the right, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, that the Jews are somehow have hidden power and they get disproportionate benefit from capitalism. And that was really always on the right. the left has started sharing that view too, that the Jews, and that has to go to the whiteness of Jews, right? Are Jews white or not white? And really, that's kind of code for privilege, right? Now, of course, it's such a ridiculous statement in many ways. Not only because there are non-white Jews, right? That is to say, Black Jews, Middle Eastern Jews, but of course, Jews may have been privileged in some way. That is the sense they've done, that liberalism has been good for the Jews. They've succeeded under liberalism. But let's also face it, liberalism under certain circumstances, that is liberal democracy, that's what I mean by liberalism. Liberal democracy has collapsed into Nazism and fascism, and which led to the destruction of a third of all Jews in the world, slaughtered like cattle. You know, we had through here in the political science department someone who gave a talk here, a really excellent talk on African American studies, and had a kind of a ranking of privileged groups in the United States. And she ranked the Jews at the top of the most privileged. And you know, she was very smart, but she was using a certain metric of kind of socioeconomic success. And I raised my hand and I said, you know, I just want to think about through this category of privilege for a second here. Right? It's one thing to talk about socioeconomic success. Fine, I'm there with you, right? That above average socioeconomic success, the Jews have been blessed with that. But, you know, 75, 80 years ago, 1 out of every 3 Jews in the world was slaughtered. How the legacy of that, right, which we're still living with today, which of course generates all the fear that we've just talking about, how does that make you privileged, right? I wish I didn't have that privilege. Right, in some ways,
yeah,
in most ways. And so, you know, this is a very strange situation that we're in right now, where both the Jews are being squeezed by the right and by the left. I neither wish to cast my vote for an anti-democratic, anti-liberal, unconstitutional, insurrectionary right, nor for, right, candidates who would support the destruction of the state of Israel from the left. And both those things seem to me to be equally unappealing alternatives.
Sure. And as you said, it seems like we're getting more and more squeezed in sort of the middle ground. I mean, this is probably a bigger issue in politics in general, but right. Somehow the, you know, trick of Jewish history is it always comes back to bite the Jews. And so, you know, there's a lot more to say about why, in general, liberal democracy is collapsing either to the left or to the right. I'm sure social media doesn't help,
in terms
of all of that. But so it's not inherently anti-Semitic when you know the right and left, you know, sort of carve out more and more to this central liberalism. But eventually it does hurt the Jews because, as you said, liberalism has treated the Jews pretty well. And so then you get into this, you know, really tough paradox of Jews are like, you know, I forgot what the technical term is, those things that you see in psychology. You look at it one way, it's sort of a vase, and you look at it the other way, it's two goblets.
Kind of a Rashomon effect.
Yeah, there we go. Where, you know, if you look at it one way, Jews in America are, you know, one of the most privileged groups, you know, certainly by socioeconomic status or by income or anything like that. And then you talk about history and you go back, you know, 1 to 3 generations of, you know, the majority of American Jews, and you hear stories where at best there was, you know, terrible, you know, almost similar in some areas, especially in the South and, you know, in waspier areas, something like, you know, if you talk about the 1920s and 30s, Jim Crow-esque laws towards American Jews, not to mention, you know, Holocaust survivors, not to mention, you know, say the Persian Jewish community that came in mass after the revolution in Iran. And so, you know, it just requires looking at it a little bit different.
Absolutely. You know, like you, I'm a little bit older than you. I grew up in Toronto, Canada. Where when I was a boy, there were Jewish golf clubs, there were Jewish card clubs, there were Jewish boat clubs. Why? Because, of course, Jews couldn't join golf clubs, card clubs, or boat clubs, so you had Jewish versions of those. And those all kind of went away. And they went away because, in my experience, the world was becoming broader and broader and more inclusive. And that was a story of the success of liberalism. Mm-hmm. A story, by the way, that Herzl, when he was looking at liberalism, said had failed, because he was looking at the results of the French Revolution, right? And said that it appeared that when he looked at the Dreyfus trial, that this was a failure of liberalism, a failure of inclusion, a failure to see Jews as citizens as opposed to Jews. And so, of course, we then went to Zionism, right, which was the alternative, which was the national alternative to the liberal Jewish model. And it appeared that in our lifetimes, both of those options were available to us, and we didn't have to choose. We neither had to choose the national option, though we could like it and love it and give money to it and send our students and children there to learn about that Jewish option. And then we can have the Jewish option here. And the problem with October 7th, both in Israel and in the United States, is both of those options appear to be off the table. If Franklin Foer is right of the end of the golden age of liberalism for Jews in the United States, of course, October 7th appears to be the end of, as you put your finger on it, right? The end of, or a gigantic failure of the Zionist vision in the Middle East. Where does that leave Jews? Insecure in both areas. And of course, that creates a tremendous psychic strain for the Jewish community. And all of us are feeling that too, both within ourselves and in our relations to others.
Yeah, so let's just talk a little bit about both of the two communities. I know it's never good to ask a political scientist for future predictions. You guys, are very good at the present and past. But let's start with Israel, because as listeners might be aware, it's a very strange moment for Israel right now. I was just looking at a Times of Israel poll published earlier this week. There is record low faith in the government.
Yes.
Right. Even before October 7th. I mean, for listeners paying any attention, Israel was torn in half by the judicial reform protests.
Right.
Bibi's under investigation for a whole, litany of, bribery and corruption. And, the government now is made up of, the most unseemly group of characters. You have, the ultra-Orthodox, fundamentalists. You have the, far right religious Zionists that seem to not care about democracy, and Bibi, who is sort of a finger to the wind, whoever will side. So that's the coalition there, representing, again, an illiberal,
right.
Call it illiberal democracy or whatever we want to call it.
Yes.
Israelis right now are feeling compelled. There is a rally around the flag
yes.
aspect also in the American Jewish community. And so Israel very much right now is also at a crossroads where, one of the things that'll be interesting over the next, 6 months of just the election, you have the Biden administration not really understanding how to play its cards, right? It seems,
yes.
Biden is sort of a little bit hiding behind Chuck Schumer. For listeners who hadn't listened to Chuck Schumer's 35-minute speech, it was a great speech. I,
yes.
Spent the morning on a phone with a friend of mine who's a little bit more right-wing, and we were debating it.
Of course.
But it was a great speech,
right.
Even if we don't like, a little bit of the ways that he phrased things at the end. But there's a lot of tension right now in terms of how to deal with Israel and in terms of internally in Israel. And everybody keeps on saying to a lot of the big questions, just wait till the day after, right? The number of times I've read that in op-eds. I visited Israel over winter break. Everybody said, whenever I would raise my hand and, we talked to activists and academics and people who were affected by October 7th, and me being the inquisitive American, right. Jew, obviously, we're there to comfort, but also it was an educational trip. So I would raise my hand and say, well, how is this going to affect? And they said, that's a day after question,
right.
which, so what is going to happen? I mean, what are those questions day after? And, assuming the war ends, let's say in the next, couple of days, weeks, months, whenever it ends, what are those big questions for the future of Israel that are on your mind?
Well, I think your analysis was summed up anything better than I could put it. But I think that my understanding from the latest polling that I've seen is that Bibi and his government, the Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government, are at record lows in the polls. And if an election would stand tomorrow, they get wiped out in an election. The military operation itself, however, is wildly popular.
Yeah.
Right. And largely because, the casualty rate, although very high, has not been astronomical yet. And also because the Israeli media has not been showing images, the same images that are on the New York Times every single day here, right, and on our networks. That's just starting to trickle in. But I think that you're right. The day the war ends, there'll be calls for an election. Now, of course, that creates an incentive for Prime Minister Netanyahu not to end the war, right, and to continue the war to the extent that his motivations are driven by staying in office so he can stay either just stay in office or stay out of prison, whichever one you think might happen. There's an incentive for him to keep on fighting, whether it's in Gaza or in the north. The north will be extremely serious, right? Because Hezbollah, my understanding, has much more serious weapons, and a far more organized and integrated military. That being said, what's really clear, and this was going on even before October 7th, and I think it's another interesting aspect of Israeli politics. Netanyahu has been for a while engaged in attacking, deconstructing the Israeli state itself, the civil service, the bureaucracy. Of course, we know about the judiciary now, but not just that, the police, the lawyers in every ministry, right, which are supposed to rule on which actions of ministries are allowed and which not. He's been attacking those as well, all with the eye to putting in his own people. And even, of course, the Likud party itself, as Gestapo, the Likud party was the rule of law party in Israel. Yeah. It was much more committed to constitutionalism, to law itself than Avodah and certainly than Mapai ever was. But increasingly over time, the Likud has become the Bibi party, and the state is becoming the Bibi state. And
there's so many loaded. I mean, sorry to cut you off. I'm just thinking, right before we started recording, we talked about how to define Zionism, because of course, being on a campus, everybody's always,
right.
Are you a Zionist or you're not a Zionist? What does that mean? One of the interesting things of the government now in Israel is that it's primarily a non-Zionist government. I mean, if you think about the ultra-Orthodox Jews, they are, right? If we think of Zionism just as a baseline Jewish right to self-determination somewhere in Israel, and that Jews will be safer with a secular, non-coercive, liberal government that has the best interest for Jews, right? That's a handful there. The Haredim don't believe in that, right? The ultranational, right, Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, right? Their vision of Zionism is a messianic vision, in which Israel needs the entirety of the West Bank and settlements, and Zionism is not complete until there's a temple on the Temple Mount. So they don't believe in that, and it kind of seems like, I mean, there's almost a giving up on Zionism from the current Israeli government.
Yes, I understand. I'm pointing to. I agree with you, by the way. I think that unless you actually have a plan for what you're going to do with the gigantic number of Palestinian Arabs that you took in under any kind of expansion, if you want the expansion and have no plan to deal with that apart from something that the vast majority of Jews in the world do not like, then you're not Zionist anymore, because you don't really believe in a Jewish state. But that's the Jewish part. I want to talk about the state part for a minute. At the core of Ben Gurion's thought. Let's go back to the George Washington of Israel. Ben Gurion's thought was
he had slightly worse hair than George Washington.
Much worse hair, and he was shorter. Shorter. But it's this idea of mamlachtiut, right? Which is really doesn't have a good English translation. It's kind of stateness, right? Or civicness. This idea that there is this, if someone acts in a mamlachti manner, they're seen to be acting in the best interest of state, right? Something higher than they are. And so Ben Gurion and even Ben Gurion concentrated on building up the state. Now that was seen by his critics as a socialist mission. But even when Begin came to power, he kept all of that around, because this was the core of the Zionist mission. The core of the Zionist mission was creating Jewish statehood. And what worries me about Netanyahu, and I think what worries many Israelis now, is he's deconstructing that. And interestingly, in the opposition now, there's not simply opposition to the right-wing policies, because I think a lot of people in the opposition are not much more left-wing on security issues. But there's also a new urge to kind of join the civil service, to be part of the state mission. It's not simply startup nation and private enterprise anymore. There's an understanding, without having this state. On October 7th, the state was a no-show. It was nowhere. It all had to be done with civic organizations. People were rushing to the front. They were taking the people who were out there protesting, who were being criticized by the right as being anti-Zionist. They were the first ones at the front. They were the first ones to be supplying with food and clothing and weapons and soldiers, right? And that is a recognition that this was not simply a failure of security policy. It was the product of years of deconstructing the Israeli state, just as we faced in the United States under COVID, when I was saying, where's my state? I want my state. right? There was no state. There was just a guy up there telling us to drink bleach, right? And that's the situation. Netanyahu, the government, the ministries were mostly, for the first weeks after October 7th, they were no-shows because they had spent too long deconstructing it and kind of using it for their own private feather bedding, if you will.
Yeah. So flipping to, across the ocean to America, I think that was a great analysis of, that definitely combined a lot of, various analyses that I've read. I think you said that really eloquently, the sort of breakdown and deconstruction of the
I
state.
have a book coming out on the subject. That's why I put it all together.
Perfect. Well, this is why I knew
you can buy it on Amazon.
No, there we go. Yeah, and we'll definitely plug your book. Maybe we'll do a follow-up podcast when the book comes out, talking about the thesis there. I'm excited to read it. Coming to America overseas from Israel, where do you see the future? Let's start both in the university and then American community writ large. The universities seem to be going through a more accelerated version of the rest of the population.
Yes,
and so,
yes.
Of course, listeners, probably the American masses' first glimpse of this was the now infamous, Harvard, MIT, Penn hearings, where it seemed like these administrators were just unwilling to say yes, saying all Jews should be killed is anti-Semitic. But it almost represented, for me, as somebody who sort of has one foot in the academy and one foot in the sort of quote unquote real world. Sorry if you don't like that dichotomy.
Cool.
I hear a little bit, and there seems to be ivory tower speak, which is, among, especially in the social sciences and humanities, oftentimes when you read papers, and this was one of my problems when I was in graduate school, because it was hard to square a lot of the academic analyses that I was reading with what I sort of saw and felt out on the streets. I felt the tension there. But there seems to be a jargon and way of understanding the world and frameworks. And we're seeing this now when talking about Zionism through the lens of, colonialism and anti-colonialism, that just, it doesn't really match one reality to how most people see the world. And I think this is all happening on campus. And this doesn't just relate to Jews. I was looking at polling right before because I knew that I wanted to ask you about this. So obviously, conservatives in America, the 45% of people that, will probably vote for Trump in the next election, if you ask them, their faith in the university, in the humanities is probably, 0 to 20%, I had to guess. Among Democrats now, there's record low faith in academic institutions. Now about half of Democrats don't trust. So that means when, and one of the interesting backgrounds here is, I think last week or this week, the Regents is actually voting on what they call J3, whether or not academic institutions can make statements about anything. But now if an academic department were to say something, if the, Center for Jewish Studies, comes out with a statement, we're almost starting off with 70% of the country thinking, well, this is a university, what do they know anyway, right? That's terrible for the future of America, right? These should be the people that, and I've told you my gripe about this before. There are scholars that have spent 10, 20, 30, 40 years studying the nuances of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They happen to be mostly spread out around universities. Those should be the people that the public are lining up to hear their nuanced, complicated discourse on, all things Israel-Palestine. And instead, universities have become the breeding ground of the most polarization, right? This obviously connects to your, sleep and protest here as well. But what happened to universities in general, separate than anti-Semitism? Why does it seem like, at least in certain departments and certain fields, it ends up just attracting this type of polarization as opposed to old school, liberal academic discourse of let's actually invite in, the pro minimum wage guy and the, minimum wage is terrible guy. And let's debate this out. Why now? And, we can all think of hundreds of examples of just opinions that are mainstream American opinions that are not fringe anywhere but a university. But the second that a university, you were to suggest, oh, maybe there's another way to understand this as opposed to a framework of, a liberation anti-colonialist framework, or, all of a sudden you seem to hit a dead end. So where's that coming from?
Well, I think really a couple of sources. On the one hand, there has been a kind of a long-term distrust, dislike of the university on the American right. And that's been there for a long time. They don't like the expertise from the university. During COVID, there was distrust of expertise from the against the medical profession, right? And this idea that expertise and learning and deep thought are not to be trusted in favor of folk sense and common sense and man on the street thing. That's been there for a while. But let's take that off the table. There's something else that's been going on, and there I think I agree with you. There has increasingly become within universities a kind of intellectual uniformity. Right? It's not everywhere. It's much more so in the humanities than the social sciences, for example. I think the social sciences are much healthier. There's a lot of debate within the social sciences. But within the humanities, a sort of uniformity that there's not a lot of debate on gigantic intellectual questions, like the Titanic ones that I sounded like an old guy here, but that when I was a student that I studied. And I think that kind of intellectual groupthink increasingly it kind of builds on itself and it feeds on itself and it moves farther and farther away from the person on the street. And that makes it really easy for people who hate universities to begin with to say, see what they're doing. You see the mishigas, the craziness that they're talking about, that's coming out of their mouths now. Now, I happen to love universities. I love universities for the reasons that you said. I love debating with my colleagues. I love asking questions, gathering the best evidence I can find, and put it out there and have people rip me apart. That's what happened in my last book. I got 30-something reviews of it. 2/3 were okay, we're fine. 1/3 said, I don't know what I'm talking about. That's fine. Totally, as long as it's respectful.
Sure.
Right. What's occurred though, at a big chunk of the university now is, and not just ours, but at others, is that when you go into the territory of disagreeing, somebody questions your goodwill, right? And calls you a fascist for being a liberal. Right? Now, this for me is unacceptable, and I don't know what to do with it. And I think it discredits the university as an enterprise. And so the distrust and dislike of the university, which of course Trump built upon because the university didn't like Trump.
Yeah.
Right. It was there. Of course, he would just like to destroy them. Right. But you're correct that even people who are not kind of political extremists, right, are saying, look, we've kind of lost our way. We've lost common sense. And when that happens, I think the universities fail to see that institutions require legitimacy. We don't exist in a complete vacuum. We have to continually justify our existence because there's people are sending us their most precious cargo, their children, right? And if they think we're propagandizing or somehow systematically not telling them a truth that we know that not to be true, then of course the enterprise is going to lose legitimacy. Now, the good news is I largely think that's not the case. If you look at like the survey results of students compared to the rest of society, let's look back to anti-Semitism. Yeah. Anti-Semitism is at the university. I have two things to tell you about this. One is it's there, but it's no more there than in the rest of society. The levels are not any higher. The other interesting thing that I've found is that if you look at the levels of anti-Semitism between first year, second year, third year, and fourth year students, you'd expect that if the students were getting systematically propagandized against Jews, the level of anti-Semitism would go up between first year and fourth year. That doesn't happen. The students largely stay with the views they had before. Now, that might be...
Which also might be a problem in the other direction.
Of course, that may be... When I say that to the chancellor of our university, he considers that a failure, and it is a failure that we should be making people less hostile towards Jews, but we're not making them more. And what that sort of tells us is either that students have very sensitive BS detectors, which they do. They're not children, or they're getting their views from elsewhere, either when they're at university or before they even arrive, kind of extra campus socialization, to use the jargon of sociology. And both of those things are probably true. But, I think you're correct. The university does need to acknowledge to themselves and to others that tenure, for example. That's an institution. Institutions have to be re-legitimated over time. There's a reason why we have tenure, and that's to give us intellectual freedom, so that when I sleep in my office here overnight, or I say to you something now that's unpopular vis-a-vis your audience, that I don't lose my job. Right? I don't lose my job. But if you know what academic freedom is, there's a difference between academic freedom and freedom of speech. Freedom of speech means I can go into the street and say the moon is made of green cheese. I have the right to do that. But academic freedom, that does not entail me being permitted to come into a classroom in astronomy and say the moon is made of green cheese. I don't get to do that. I have to speak within the standards of the profession itself, as judged by my colleagues. But if the standards themselves are no longer judged to be reasonable, sensible, and adequate, then we're in big, big trouble. And there I agree with you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's certainly a problem that of course needs to be fixed for the good of the university. I, like you, love the,
I love universities.
I've lived at a university for 15 years, not quite literally slept, in one, but between undergrad and grad school and now working for Hillel and teaching at UCI, I there's nothing I love more than the discourse around a university, which is why it's so sad to see the losing respect for especially the non-STEM parts. I mean, I think I mentioned this to Jeffrey Bludinger when in our podcast, but the number of times I hear from parents, all the time, prospective high schoolers and parents will call me, and in general, the second I'm at any Jewish function and somebody finds out that I work with college students, I'm sure it's the same with you, they have their whole list of questions for me about how do you survive, do you wear a kippah, is it safe? But the number of parents that will say something like, but my kids should only study STEM at a university, right? That's the, as if that's the only, and there might be some economic consideration, yes. There's changing anyway with, talking to a bunch of students here, it hasn't been so easy for STEM people to get jobs either. That industry is changing as well. But I think it points to much more of what we're talking about
I
now.
agree.
The delegitimization. And the problem is, and here's sort of the, just to give voice to the strongest possible counter argument against the humanities, so you can then defend it. If I take a class on kinematics, right, an intro physics class, it doesn't make a difference if my professor is a Republican, Democrat, fundamentalist Jew, atheist, Buddhist, whatever. I'm going to learn largely the same, equations. If somebody takes a intro to Zionism class,
yes.
you could envision 20 different ways that class is taught, yes. with just completely different, yes. ideologies baked into it. Some being too pro-Zionist, some being too anti-Zionist, some understanding it through a Marxist lens, some understanding it through a colonialist lens, some understanding it from a Jewish textual perspective, right? And there lies the problem, I think.
I suppose. Yeah. In part, I mean, my ideal when I teach is my students shouldn't be able to know what my politics are. And if they really pry, I usually... Well, I'll break down and say my politics are extremely boring, right? Extremely boring. I'm for peace and prosperity, right?
But you are unique, right? I just want to.
I don't know.
Highlight that, or maybe not unique, but especially with the proliferation of social media and everybody expected to be, yes. Public with their opinions, and there is pressure on people that are either academics or, even Hillel. I mean, we feel it also, something happens in the world, George Floyd protests. Why is Hillel not yet posted, hashtag Black Lives Matter? And so, okay, maybe we post, maybe we don't during the Me Too movement, all of those questions at large. There is a growth of, and we've discussed this too, and this is also part of the problem of academics and more so graduate students also who are using their power, quite literally, as being handlers of the institution or of leading classes, to actually say, when I teach Zionism as a part of my Jewish text class, we read Herzl, we read a Chada'am, we read a religious Zionist account, and we read a Jewish critique of Zionist account from the early 1900s. And, the Jewish students the students in general can look at the Jewish community there, and they can understand this was a debate, and there was a debate about what Zionism is, and some people thought it was a bad idea. But I would guess that if you go into some, graduate student or other people there, Zionism is just one thing and it's bad, as opposed to, no, let's actually understand this in the multi... Yeah.
No, you're right, and I think there are two ways of thinking about that, right? One is intellectual diversity within the same course, right? That is to say, as you just outlined it, let's take all the different takes on this. I'm not going to tell you what my view is, But let's read all of these different takes. The second view is you're going to take multiple courses. Maybe each of the professors have a different take on it, and that would be okay too. You know, I think within reason. I think professors who use their classrooms as a kind of a pulpit for ideologizing the students or for politicizing the classroom, much less discriminating against students in the classroom, that's malpractice.
Yeah, no, I
That's
totally
clear
agree. And
malpractice.
my favorite thing, and you'll appreciate this because, you know, my identity anyway is weird because I'm both a rabbi and also I teach.
Right.
After the, you know, there's a couple weeks in the Jewish text class. The next quarter, I'll be teaching a medieval Jewish thought class where we go through, you know, a lot of the heavy hitters of Jewish thought.
Right.
So, you know, everything from Rajagona and Maimonides to, you know, Kabbalistic text, you know, Hasidic text, you know, secular, you know, we read some Spinoza. And always, you know, around week 7 or 8, I'll get students showing up to office hours and they say, wait a minute, what do you believe? It's so unclear because when you talk, you know, during the week of Maimonides, we were sure you're Maimonidean and a hyper-rationalist. And then when we talk about the Zohar, you seem like you're, you know, a Kabbalist. And then we talked about Spinoza and it seems like you might not believe in God. And then we talked about, you know, they're like, what do you make? And I love that. And, you know,
I do the same thing when I teach Marx.
So, yeah.
When I teach Marx, I mean, you know, when I teach Marx, I feel an obligation to try to teach any theorist at their very best. And the students all think I'm a Marxist by the end of that because I've tried to do it justice. Yeah. And then, of course, I start to pull at the threads. I say, well, you know, you might want to think about this aspect of what he was saying. Is the labor theory of value actually correct, right? You know, and what does it actually mean that there's an end of history? I mean, so when does this actually end? Are we on the off ramp or on the on ramp? And I raise these questions, and then slowly they start to see the value in this deep thought. And that's really the best argument in favor of the humanities. The best argument in favor of the humanities is that you'll never have a time in your life again when you can encounter these great texts. Any undergraduate who has not read Plato's Republic does not have the right to consider him or herself an educated person. There, I said it. And I firmly believe that. This is the time to do this. Right? Yes, you can go off and study business administration and accounting. And I often think like, okay, what is this field? Buy low, sell high, right? Fine. Right? Okay, maybe that's going too far. But I also think while you're doing that, you need to read the great books. They're hard to do. It's not a tweet. You should learn a foreign language while you're here, while you're young, while your mind is still capable of assimilating that. And it should be as hard a language as possible. Don't learn an easy one, learn a hard one, because you have a systematic advantage when you're young. Read these hard books, write about these hard books. This 5-page essay that you're going to write about this, no matter what you're doing in your life, you're going to be writing that 5-page essay. If you can't do that, you're going to be in big trouble down the line, no matter what you're doing, no matter how good you are at physics or programming or whatever, coding or whatever they do now, right? You have to be able to do this. Statistics, we live in a quantitative world. I believe in a liberal arts education. Right? And everybody should get that, no matter what they study. And the professors who don't encourage that, I think they're also guilty of malpractice. I think that's what the great university is all about. And even if the only profitable part of our university were the medical school, our students should still be studying classics. Yeah. Right? I think it's extremely important.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. So we've been talking for a while. I know you are slowly on your way up to give a final exam on anti-Semitism. It is the only time for listeners thinking you are cheating on your sleep in.
I need to cheat for 2 hours to go give a final exam.
Okay, we will give you in Judaism we would say a heter, right? A halachic
hall pass.
A halachic hall pass to do it. Do you have any closing thoughts here, either about this sleep in protest or about just anything, you know, that you've been thinking about, you know?
It's extremely important to me that what I'm doing here not be instrumentalized against the university, against universities in general. I don't want that. I think universities are fantastic places. This is the big league, European soccer. This is the Bundesliga. This is the top league of higher education in the world. There's a reason why people want to come here from all over the world. I simply want to make it better, to restore it to what I think it can be. And I don't want to be used. I think the problem with those hearings that you pointed to quite correctly, right, was that those university presidents, sure, they were under the Klieg lights for 4 hours and they broke. right? But those politicians that were up there, they were using them for their own reasons, right? And I don't want to be instrumentalized, and I don't want to be used, right? I have a very specific agenda here, and I won't deviate from it. I will neither permit the Center for Jewish Studies to be used as a propagandistic tool, nor do I wish to see it closed down in the face of radicalized students, right? And both of those things, I think right now, I'm wishing to oppose.
Yeah, well, thank you. Everything that you're doing for both academia writ large and also in the more narrow focus of the Jewish community. I hope you have a comfortable sleep tonight.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
I had told you I'm no stranger to camping out, so I have the whole litany of camping gear to give you if you need anything. But thank you again.